us this evening. Let me welcome you on behalf of GFSIS, now already Rondelli Foundation. And I'm sure that Alex Rondelli would have been happy knowing that Dr. Teresa Sabonis Health is presenting at GFSIS today. And I have the honor to introduce to you our distinguished speaker. As I mentioned, Dr. Teresa Sabonis Health, who is a professor of national security studies at the strategy at the National War College, Washington, D.C., where she has been teaching since 2001. She specializes in energy security, energy politics, and politics of Central Asia and the Caucasus. She is also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University in the Science, Technology, and International Affairs program, and a member of Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Sabonis has also served on the NATO Defense College's Academic Advisory Board and on the Admiral Stavridis European Command Advisory Panel. She has lived and worked in 7 countries of the post-Soviet space, and has lectured and published intensively. These are but few out of her long on the energy politics, energy security of our country. And as you have seen from the title of the event, it's quite intriguing. Thus, I won't take long, and will give you just small administrative remarks that for 30 minutes about the presentation, and I'm pretty sure that you'll be having lots of questions. Thus, 30 minutes presentation, and then we'll move to question and answer session. Thank you, and the floor is yours.
So I want to talk today about being a transit state and what are the advantages and disadvantages. And if you think about it from Georgia's perspective, which is more familiar for you, then is a little bit hard to understand the perspective of other countries. So what I'm going to do is get you to think about what does an exporting state want from a transit state, what does an importing state want from a transit state, and what are the pressures that that creates for the state that is in the middle. If we look at the map of the post-Soviet space, which apparently we're not going to. Hold on. Okay. There we go. In the early post-Soviet period, there were only 2 lines on this map. Not only did all roads go to Moscow, all pipelines went through Moscow as well. And the first pipeline built in the post-Soviet space that was different was the Chechen Loop. And it was built around Chechnya because, of course, the Chechens realized that it was a way to damage the Russian economy, but it devastated the Azeri economy because that was Azerbaijan's only route out. As more oil and gas got discovered and exploited, there were all sorts of new ways and routes, and every state came up with a different strategy. And the strategies, I want to talk for a moment about the difference between what Kazakhstan chose to do and what Azerbaijan chose to do, because they came up with very different ways of what they thought was securing their way to get to a market. So I'll start with Kazakhstan. President Nazarbayev was very clear about the fact that it was Kazakhstan's strategic interest to export to all 4 points of the compass. And although he showed a preference to Moscow, he pursued very carefully every possible direction and managed to secure one way to go in each direction. And so the first pipeline built that was not owned by Russia was actually a privately owned pipeline across Russian territory. It was the first, and it is still the only privately owned pipeline that goes across Russian territory, and it had some mixed success. Then Kazakhstan pursued an oil pipeline to China, which Russia actually helped them build. Then Kazakhstan pursued something that we don't often hear about, but it's actually quite important. Iran has an energy crisis in its north, because all of the oil and gas production is in the south, and the infrastructure is rather poor. And since all the population center is in Tehran, Iran always has this problem with energy. So the arrangement that Kazakhstan made is called a swap. And we'll come back to this later because Iran has grown very fond of swaps. The idea is they put oil on a barge and they bring it to the port of Naqqa, and Iran takes this oil and uses it in Tehran, and takes an equivalent amount of oil out of the south and puts it in a tanker labeled Kazakhstan and sends it to the world. This is very attractive because when Iran was under sanctions, this was a way to continue to do some limited exporting. But it's also very attractive because Iran saves the cost of moving oil from its south up to the north. And for Kazakhstan, it was very satisfying because that's another direction. They also barge oil into the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline. And regularly, Azerbaijan says, wouldn't you like to put in a permanent pipeline? And Kazakhstan says, it is in the national interest of Kazakhstan to export from all points to all points of the compass. So Kazakhstan maintains flexibility as much as they can, and that is their strategy. Azerbaijan has a different and very interesting strategy. We can think of it as the UN strategy. Whenever there is a new tender in Azerbaijan to develop oil or gas, Azerbaijan gives preference to a country that isn't already in Azerbaijan. And their theory is that so many nations have an interest in the pipeline that it is essentially defended with flags. This is a curious and very different approach to what Kazakhstan was using, but it has also been moderately successful, and Azerbaijan is quite satisfied. Let's look at some of the other issues that emerge. Now, there were a lot of pipelines. The previous slide I showed you is ones that were built. I want to talk for a minute about 3 pipelines that were proposed. In 2008, all 3 of these pipelines, everybody was talking about them. And 1 of them was built, and 2 of them never will be. So as we try to understand about transit states, I want you to think about why these pipelines unfolded the way they did. So the pipeline that was completed is the one up north. It's Nord Stream. It is an undersea pipeline. It very carefully goes in international waters. It goes directly from Russia to Germany. And from Russia's perspective, it is a brilliant pipeline because there are no transit states. The biggest customer buys directly from them. From Germany's perspective, it is a brilliant pipeline because they are the transit state. They're the largest customer, but they also put some additional gas and sell it further on from Germany. So this pipeline was extremely economically attractive. It's actually a little bit of an economic miracle because it was built during the great economic recession when it was very difficult to find money for anything. There were so many prospective investors that they were turning them away. So this pipeline was completed. It was completed very rapidly. It's very popular. Now, by contrast, I want you to look at the 2 pipelines to the south, and let's think about this for a minute. All right. Oh, there's a better picture of the Nord Stream project. The Nord Stream project, by the way, was politically extremely controversial because although it goes through international waters, it made irrelevant a number of transit states that were used to having involvement in transit. And it also created a situation where German prosperity was very closely connected to Russian prosperity. So from the perspective of states like Poland, it gave Russia and Germany some very strong interests in common that Poland believed were threatening to Europe. These states in the middle, the Baltic states and Poland, all tried to block this pipeline. They petitioned against it. But under European law, you can only block a pipeline if there's an environmental threat. So they said, oh, there's a terrible environmental threat. And after 2 years of investigation, it was ruled that there was not. The fact that geostrategically it is a problem is not a legal reason to prevent the building of a pipeline. But it did create several interesting geostrategic problems because now Russia has a very plausible reason why they need a larger military force because they have an important strategic object there. And also we are aware in the modern world that pipelines like this are usually laid with fiber optic in the middle of it, so Russian intelligence concerning the states that the pipeline runs past has been significantly improved by the pipeline. So here you see a pipeline that was economically brilliant and simple. Geostrategically, it really changed the interests of several states. They did, by the way, manage to build the entire thing in international waters, so they ended up not having to get permission of any of the states because they stayed out of the economic exclusive zones. Okay, so if that pipeline got built and got built very quickly, what was the problem with these other two? Well, what's interesting here is that pipelines usually have a very good economic logic or a very good political logic. If they have a little bit of each, they will succeed. If they have an economic logic, they will succeed. If they have only a political logic, they usually don't. So here's what happened. If you look at Nabucco, which was a long dream of the European Union, and everybody loved this pipeline, they loved this pipeline because it ran through so many countries. So each country would be guaranteed some energy security. Commercially, companies hate a pipeline that runs through many countries because in every transit country you have to negotiate differently. What is the cost to pass your territory? What are the rules for gas on your territory? And this pipeline ended in a small consumer instead of in a big consumer. So for economic logic, Nabucco was brilliant politically for the European Union, but it didn't make any economic sense, and so in the end it was not built. The opposite case was South Stream. Russia said, oh, you like Nord Stream, why don't we try South Stream? And they proposed to go undersea, to bump onto land in Bulgaria, and then to go into a set of states to try to compete with Nabucco. It was politically logical, it was very advantageous for Russia, but as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine, the European Union found legal grounds on which to deny permits for the pipeline to operate on European territory. So it was a pipeline that died. It was a political goal of one state and a political threat to another group of states, and so it was never built. All right, so we've got two here that didn't get built. What actually are you looking for in a transit state? When I worked in Kazakhstan in the mid-1990s, the US ambassador to Kazakhstan actually literally had a bumper sticker on the embassy vehicle, and it said, happiness is multiple pipelines. And if you think about it, for some players, it is. For a state that wants to export, multiple pipelines is beautiful. For a state that wants to import, multiple pipelines makes you feel much more secure. For a transit state, if you can have multiple pipelines, that's wonderful. So from a state perspective, it's a great idea. But if you're a company, happiness is full pipelines. Unless you have a very strong political reason to build a pipeline that is not full, you're not going to do it. When you build a pipeline, you're thinking about a 30-year future. You want it to be full for 30 years, and you want to be able to make stable agreements for 30 years. And if there are too many pipelines happening at once, you're not going to get the security that you need to invest. So we have two contradicting logics. From a market perspective, you got a 30-year view, and whether it's a gas or an oil pipeline, and these are very different in some ways, but they're similar in one way. If you build a pipeline, you can double its capacity without building new infrastructure. You may have to put in some new pump stations, but it's very simple to double the capacity of a pipeline. So you build it, you want it to be full. You build it knowing that you can double its capacity if the market unfolds the way that you want it to. But you never want to build a pipeline that you don't think is going to be full. Okay, so you don't get to pick your neighbors, and in fact, your pipeline is going to have to transit your neighbors. But if you could pick from among neighbors, what are you really looking for in a transit state? Now here, if you're the exporter, so if you own the resource and you're looking to decide, how shall I send it? Your first rule, and we saw this in Nord Stream, we also saw this in the collapse of Nabucco, your first rule is you want to cross as few states as possible. Your second thing is you want to send it across, if you have to cross a state, you want that state to have predictable demand. You do not want a state that's suddenly going to want more and more. You want to be able to predict how much does this state need. And ideally, you want it to be a state that doesn't have any resources. Because if I'm Kazakhstan and I'm building the pipeline, I'd like to fill it with Kazakh oil, So I'd like to send it across countries that are not going to compete with my Kazakh oil. So ideally, if I can have it, and maybe I can't because I can only work with my neighbors, but so I would like a transit state that doesn't have any resources, and I'd like it to be a state that's weaker than I am. I'd like it to be a state that cannot leverage me too heavily. Because when I'm building the pipeline, they will promise me everything. But once the pipeline is built, they have some real power. We call this the obsolescing bargain. You make a deal, and over time the deal you made becomes obsolete because power changes. So I want a state that's weaker than I am so that they will continue to honor the agreement we made and so that I can keep an eye on them. This is my preference. All right? I want very clear agreements with my transit state, and I want my transit state to be able to enforce what they say they will do. In many ways, Ukraine became a nightmare transit state even before it fell apart because gas had this incredible way of disappearing in Ukraine. The government didn't have the capacity to monitor and keep the pipeline safe. So even when Ukraine made an agreement, they couldn't enforce it. That's not what anyone's looking for in a transit state. All right, so that's what the exporter wants. The importer wants something a little different. So this is the end consumer, the country that's going to buy the most oil or gas. So think of it as Germany or think of it as China. Now, the importing state also wants as few states in the middle as possible. They want to make a deal with the producer and they want that deal to hold. But, and they would like to cross a state, one state simply, but if that state in the middle has some additional resources, this is wonderful for the state at the end. Because if I'm China, if I have a pipeline that not only crosses Turkmenistan but also crosses Uzbekistan, now I can create some competition between Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan because here's a pipeline and both of them have gas and I can make a deal to fill it. So if I'm the buying state, I would like to cross states that have additional resources. And I would also like to make sure that the states I cross have less leverage than I do. Would I rather, if I'm China, would I rather go across Kazakhstan or Russia? I'll take Kazakhstan because my power relative to Kazakhstan is much greater. And so that's attractive for me because I think I can make a deal and I can make that deal stick. All right? But again, I want clear agreements and I want the country to be able to enforce what it says it will do. So in a sense, what all states are looking for in a transit state is a certain amount of stability of demand, stability of government, ability to enforce contracts, and a certain level of, I don't care if they're transparent or not, I'm perfectly happy with secret agreements, but I'd like them to be clear. And when I make them, I'd like them to not change unless I say they change. So that's what everybody's kind of looking for in a transit state. Now, this raises an interesting question. Georgia is a transit state for many other countries, but for whom is Georgia an ideal transit state? Well, Georgia is able to enforce contracts after they're made. The levels of corruption in gas are not so great that gas is delivered in different volumes than promised. Turkey likes Georgia as a transit state because Turkey is relatively stronger. Russia does like Georgia as a transit state. They don't like Georgia for much, but they like Georgia as a transit state because they have that difference of relative power. And again, Georgia having no resources of its own is not going to compete for space in the pipelines. So in that sense, Georgia is very attractive for other states. And Georgia's one of the main strategic goals that the Ministry of Energy here has identified is Georgia wants to stay an attractive transit state for both north-south and east-west. In a few minutes we'll talk and think about does that make sense, but that's a goal. You want to, according to the ministry, you want to remain a transit state in sort of like Nazarbayev's Kazakhstan. You've got four-way connections here. You've got north-south and east-west, and the goal is to preserve those. North-south, you've got the Russia, Georgia, Armenia, and I'm going to talk in a minute about what has changed in the past 2 years, and that's Iran. We'll come back to that in a minute. But so there is north-south transit, and then of course the east-west transit you all are very familiar with, and we know that that is expanding. So if you think about Georgia, and you think about how much states depend on transiting Georgia for their supply, what you see is that north-south is very small. The total volume of trade that goes north-south is actually, it's 2.5 billion cubic meters a year going from Russia south and 1 million going north from Iran. So it's less than 4 billion cubic meters per year go north-south and involve Georgia in any way. East-west, it's much larger. Right now you have 25 billion cubic meters a year going east-west, and when the new pipeline system is built, that's going to go up dramatically. There is a big debate about where you're going to end, but it will be at least 60 billion cubic meters a year. Now, regardless of whether you think in those numbers or not, think about this. Georgia itself, the total amount that Georgia consumes in a year is 2. And the amount going across Georgia's territory right now is about 30 and will become between 60 and 100. So Georgia is a very small consumer with stable demand in the middle of large and increasing flows of gas. All right? But Iran is waking up. And what's happening is not what you expect. Yes, Iran is building pipelines to export, but those pipelines are pipelines to Pakistan, and those pipelines are to the south. In the north, what Iran is reviving is what used to be there. In the Soviet era, there was a gas loop, and the gas loop involved swaps. Nazarbayev's idea to do these swaps with Iran is an old idea that's come back to life. So essentially what Iran is interested in doing is taking these pipelines up in the north and making them available for transit so that Iran in the north becomes a transit state, while in the south it is a major exporter. Now this is a little bit tricky because remember, your perfect transit state will not compete with you in the pipeline. But Iran wants to be a transit state. And the infrastructure is there. Already, Azerbaijan exports gas to Iran. In exchange for the gas, Iran transits gas to Nakhchivan because since Azerbaijan is broken in 2 pieces, they run their gas through Iran and pay Iran in gas in order to do it. In recent years, Iran has transited 20% of Turkey's gas, 18% of Armenia's, and with Azerbaijan it's all swaps. They don't get gas from Iran, but they swap gas with Iran. Now why does this matter? This matters because the Iran-Armenia relationship has fundamentally changed the Georgia transit role for Russia. Russia is now considering, together with Iran, doing swaps to supply Armenia. So if Russia makes the swap arrangements with Armenia, then it will create a situation where Iran supplies Armenia, Russia supplies northern Iran, and it's a little bit crazy because what's happening is the swaps. Now, Azerbaijan isn't going to want to talk about this, but yes, what's happening is, or what's potentially happening, is Russian gas mixed with Azeri gas will supply Iran, and Iranian gas mixed with Azeri gas will supply Armenia. So it's really quite ironic, but it is because of this that Russia's been able to come back to the negotiating table and say, okay, Georgia, you were a transit state that was important to us. We're not so sure that we want to use you anymore. And it is in this climate that, that Georgia was compelled to do negotiations, and we'll talk about those in just a minute. But essentially, what Georgia did, and in the discussion part we'll debate whether this was a good deal or a bad deal, but what Georgia decided, what the ministry defended, is that they want, Russia has said, we will not extend the existing contract. So if there is gas in the pipeline and you don't agree to a new contract, and you take any of it, we'll sue you for theft. Now, we will keep using the pipeline because our Iran deal isn't in place yet, but would you like to make a new deal with us? Or are you going to behave in a lawless transit state way like Ukraine did? So Georgia accepted a deal that they didn't like, and the deal was, okay, we will no longer take gas in payment. You're going to pay us to transit the country. We have a year to finish making the transition. We will buy gas from Russia, and you will pay us for transit. So we'll convert everything. We'll monetize it. We'll convert it in money. The Georgian argument, again, we're going to debate this. The Georgian argument is we do not want to lose Russian transit. Hold that thought. We'll decide, or we'll try to decide whether that is logical or not. But the whole idea was that Georgia doesn't want to have transit going only from one country. That although relations are better with Azerbaijan than they are with Russia, to lose Russia supply coming across Georgia makes Georgia much more vulnerable than to keep Russian supply. Now, the idea of any energy security coming from Russia, I know, sounds very strange, and that's why we're going to debate it. But that was the logic. So the argument is you want to have this cross of energy going across Georgia, even if you make less money while you're doing it. All right? Now, that's not the only kind of transit that takes place in Georgia, because Georgia is beginning to play and is trying to grow a role in a new kind of transit. And it's actually a more controversial kind of transit because it hasn't been done well in a lot of places. Georgia dreams of being a transit state for electricity. And now Georgia dreams of that because you have seasonal electricity. So in the summer you have too much, and in the winter you don't have enough. So if you can make your grid larger, if you can create ways to trade, then that's energy security in a way. But let's look at what it looks like. And by the way, it's quite fun. GSE on their website has an interactive link where you can look at it, and it will tell you at any given moment how the electricity is flowing. So yesterday, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I checked to see how the electricity was flowing. And yesterday in the afternoon, Georgia was importing electricity from both Armenia and Azerbaijan. The connections to Russia were turned off. And because it's not a season when you have lots of extra hydro, there was no electricity to be exported. So Georgia was importing. Now, it's important to understand that there's two different ways to trade electricity across borders. One of them, and you'll hear people say this, and just so that you understand what it means, most of the trade that you're doing with Armenia and the trade that you're doing with Turkey is called, they call it back-to-back. What back-to-back trade is you imagine that you've got a big battery. This is oversimplifying, but imagine. You've created a system where your electricity doesn't naturally flow back and forth across the border. But when you want to, you can run it through a battery so that your system stays stable no matter what's going on in the other system, but you can push electricity down to them. A back-to-back converter, for those of you who do engineering, is you're converting direct current to alternating current back to direct current, and by doing that, you're protecting your grid. So you've protected your grid from Turkey and from Armenia. So you can trade electricity in large amounts, or you can ignore each other, which is rather nice, because then you're only trading when it's advantageous to both countries to trade. The older systems, the systems that have been in place for many years since the Soviet times, are not back-to-back. They're direct connections, and those connections make for some particular challenges. The main challenge is you've got to bring the line down to make sure that power isn't leaking. So it's a more closely connected system. Those are the old systems. Georgia's moving away from old systems and moving more toward back-to-back because it protects the integrity of the electricity system in Georgia better if you have back-to-back. Okay? But it's slow and it's hard and it hasn't been done everywhere yet. All right? It isn't the only piece of your grid, but you might not be aware of the fact that Nguri is 30% of the installed power in the nation of Georgia. So one single electricity power plant, hydropower, is 30% of all the electricity generation you have on the territory of Georgia. And that wouldn't be so bad, except in the middle of the winter, this great big piece of your electricity infrastructure operates at 1/3 capacity. So even though it's theoretically over 1,000 megawatts, in the middle of the winter, you've got 1/3 of that available to use. So you've got a grid, you can imagine it as being kind of manic depressive. In the summer, when the water is flowing fast, you have lots of electricity, and you're actually but selling very cheaply a lot of it to Russia because you've got too much in your system. And in the winter, when you don't have enough, you're importing it. In many of the past 5 years, if you just measure the volts, Georgia is a net exporter of electricity. So if you add the whole year together, but you have never been a net exporter in terms of money, because the power is always very cheap in the summer and very expensive in the winter. So even though you're exporting, when you import, you're paying a lot more than you get when you export because it's supply and demand. And in the summer, you have too much electricity. Okay. So Nguri was taken down for 10 days this month. It came back up last week, actually almost 10 days ago. And the reason that they were bringing it down was to do an inspection. And there are, if you look on paper, when you look at a power plant, there is what's called nameplate capacity. And what that means is, when you were first opened, what did they say was the maximum amount you could generate? Nguri's nameplate capacity is 1,300 megawatts, but actually, a significant part of it doesn't work at all. You've got the main turbines still work, the smaller turbines do not. And here's what makes Nguri such an interesting problem, and I use the word interesting gently. In 1996, there was an agreement between Abkhazia and Georgia about Nguri. You have to understand why there was this agreement. Nguri itself is located in Georgia. But in order to make a little bit of water generate more electricity, the Soviets built a 15-kilometer downhill tunnel. So you can picture this. The water is trapped, and it's redirected to go down a steep hill so that it's going faster when it hits the turbines, and it creates electricity. It's called a pressure tunnel system. There are a few of them in the world. It's a little bit exotic, but they do exist. The problem is, 9 kilometers of the tunnel is in Georgia, 6 kilometers of the tunnel is in Abkhazia, and the power plant is in Abkhazia. Now, in fact, here's what happened. In '96, the agreement was made between Abkhazia and Georgia that Abkhazia would recognize Georgian ownership, allow Georgia to manage the facility, to come and go, and to run it, and in exchange, Georgia would give Abkhazia 40% of all the electricity that Nguri generates. At the time, it seemed like a pretty good deal for everybody because if you think about it, if the Georgians can't access the facility, nobody gets any electricity. The Abkhaz do not have the technical experts to run the power plant without Georgia, and even if they could find them, if Georgia just opened up the dam, there'd be no power. So it is a situation where there has to be cooperation or you cannot generate electricity. So that was the deal, 40%. Well, Georgia has not liked this agreement very much because, of course, not recognizing a legal status of Abkhazia, how do you make this agreement work when you don't recognize each other? And how do you enforce it? So after the war in 2008, Russia approached Georgia with a new deal. And you may remember this because when it leaked out into the press, all hell broke loose. But the secret deal was Russia will recognize Georgian ownership of the dam. InterRAO, the big electricity company, will manage it for 10 years, and InterRAO will allow Georgia to essentially hold hostage the pieces of the electricity grid that Russia owns in Georgia. And this agreement was made because it seemed more manageable than the existing agreement. But when the Russians leaked it, the Abkhaz were incensed. Because here were the Russians making a secret deal with the Georgians about how to run their electricity. So everybody gave up and said, all right, never mind. Not doing anything to see here, we're going to do the 1996 agreement. But here's the problem. You guys remember how prices went up in Georgia? You remember how everyone had to be metered and learn to pay their electricity bills and how unpleasant that was? None of that has happened yet in Abkhazia. We are now in a world where Abkhazia consumes more electricity than Tbilisi, and per capita, Abkhazia consumes 13 times as much electricity as a citizen of Tbilisi. Demand has been going up and up and up. And partly it's because, answer the question, how much free electricity do you need? More. How much free electricity do you need from your adversary? A lot more. So demand in Abkhazia has grown and grown and grown, and now the grid in Abkhazia is unstable. All the rest of Georgia has built a very good grid, a very professional grid. You are bleeding electricity in Abkhazia. But what do you do? What is the solution? Because without something that Abkhazia and Georgia both agree to, you can't operate. This is a third of your grid. So this is the biggest single energy object Georgia owns. And it's in a place where without making deals all the time, you can't run it. So if you think about this, there's a couple of really complicated problems here. The World Bank won't touch Nguri. It's contested territory. The only international lender that will touch it is EBRD, and in fact they are funding the repairs that are going to take place a year from now. But here's the problem. Okay, Georgia's willing to invest another $30 million of the EBRD's money into keeping Abkhazia operating. How much are you willing to invest? If you can't get a different or better deal, how long are you willing to do this? Nobody knows. The repairs that are taking place are going to be not all the repairs, they're going to be the most urgent repairs. When does Georgia decide that Nguri isn't worth it anymore? Or when do Georgia, Abkhazia, and somehow Russia come up with a different way of managing it so that it's not losing money? It's a huge, complicated, weird political problem because the technology for keeping the plant running is very straightforward. It's a beautiful piece of infrastructure. It produces very cheap electricity. Problem is, it's cheap, not free, and you have to give away 40% of it. So how do you even think about this? This is the big hole in the Georgian electricity sector that nobody wants to address because no one has a good answer. The inspection was completed, and there was a great sigh of relief. The reason there was a great sigh of relief is because the worst problem turned out not to, they were afraid that it might be the case. It's not. So the worst problem that everybody was worried about is not a problem. But it is going to be expensive, and there are a whole set of problems with the power plant. We can talk about this more later, but the actual bids from the contractors about how they're going to repair them, it's going to be another month before we have the estimates. But there's a lot of interesting problems. And the biggest problem at Nguri right now is silt. Sand, dirt, piling up. Nguri was supposed to be at the bottom of a line of power plants. And the power plants that were supposed to be built higher up on the river were supposed to catch silt. And they don't, because they don't exist. So the siltation problem, that too much sand coming down the river, building up against the dam, building up in the tunnel, building up even in the drainage canal that's supposed to go into the sea, is a big problem. The government would rather finish Nanskra and then deal with the siltation, because once Nanskra is in place, then you have a sediment management program above Nguri. Until you do something to stop the sediment further up, you can clean it out, but it's going to keep coming down. So again, we can debate about whether that's smart or not, but the plan is to get Nanskra in place with a better sediment management plan before you try to remove all the sand that is building up and kind of burying parts of Nguri. All right, so at this point I want to turn it around to you guys, and there's some big debates about energy in Georgia, and they all connect to not Georgia making enough energy for itself, but Georgia making enough energy for itself and being more energy secure. So there's a big movement to do gas storage in Georgia. What's the argument in favor of doing gas storage? Why would you do it? Okay, so that you have a reserve. When the gas stops coming, you've got about a day's worth of it in the pipes. But usually any problem that takes your gas down takes it down for more than a day. You can deal better with the suppliers because you are less vulnerable. Why else do you want gas storage?
For improving the energy security degree of the country in general.
Yes. Let me tell you something about gas storage that's important to keep in mind. Yeah. Yes, you can. Right. So if Georgia is going to use gas as their backup for hydro, since hydro is seasonal, you want to make sure that you have emergency stores, because it's bad enough if somebody can cut off your heat. If they can cut off your light too, then you've got a real problem. Here's the thing about gas storage. If you're a supplier, you want gas storage in your transit state as close to the border as possible. Because when the temperature drops dramatically, not only does demand of your end customer go up, but gas shrinks a little bit. It is sensitive to temperature, so when it's really cold, suddenly there's a little bit less gas in your pipeline. And if you want to be a perfectly reliable supplier, you would like there to be a big pot of gas right near your customer that you can pull a little bit out and throw it into the pipeline. So it isn't only Georgia that would like to have gas storage. SOCAR would very much like to have gas storage in Georgia. But do you want to do that? Do you want to let SOCAR have commercial access or negotiated access or any access to your gas storage? For the right price, you'd be willing to do it? It's a big debate. You can't build the gas storage and invest in it until you decide whether you're going to allow SOCAR to have a minority stake or not. You want it, but there is debate about whether that increases your vulnerability, because then you can't use it to balance against SOCAR playing around with price as effectively. All right? Yeah. That's true. Yes. Well, in any major pipeline, you want to have gas storage as part of your infrastructure. The problem is there are very few places that are ideal for storing gas. One of the reasons why Russia is so bitter about the loss of Ukraine is that, if you can imagine it, has a set of salt caves that provide 30 billion cubic meters storage. In other words, for most pipelines, that is an entire year's worth of flow. Ukraine has the ability to store that on its territory. Unfortunately, they weren't very good at controlling it, and the gas in their storage facility had a way of disappearing. And
It's also what you mentioned, enforcing.
exactly.
Enforcing is the key.
And this is another key part of the Georgian question. You have to make sure that if you're going to have gas storage, that enforcement, that making sure that it's not easy for the gas to disappear, is a critical component if you actually want it to enhance both your energy security and your reputation as a reliable supplier. All right, so those are some of the problems, and depending on what you want it for, and how much it's going to cost you, there really are a whole set of questions about how much is this going to cost us, and who pays for it. Because energy security is not free, and it's often not very market-based. So who pays for that? SOCAR says, hey, we'll pay for part of it if we can use it. And Georgia has to decide. Do you want somebody else to help pay for it with the proviso that they may want to use it? So it's an unresolved strategic question, but it does get to both your role as a transit state and the question of providing for your own people and negotiating effectively. Okay, so this second one I already mentioned a little bit. The deal that Georgia used to have, where you get 10% of the gas that transits your property in payment for allowing transit, is not the best deal in the world, but it's close, okay? Iran actually gets a 15% deal with gas that transits its territory, but it's very unusual to get that good of a deal. And a year from now, you're not going to get it anymore. What do you think of the argument that you want to make sure that you've still got Russian gas transiting Georgia? Do you want that? Okay, why?
Because the quantity of gas imported from Russia is not small compared to what is imported from other spots.
Good. So,
So you have some money to buy
Mhm.
energy, I'm not saying gas, necessarily, from other sources.
good. All right, so two good reasons. One, the Russian volumes are much smaller. And number two, since they're actually going to pay for transit, you don't have to use that money to buy gas. You can use it for something else. And in fact, what Georgia negotiated is they are making no guarantee to Russia that they will buy any. It is completely, you negotiate it as you go, but it is not a commitment to buy gas. You don't have to buy any under the new agreement. They have to pay to transit. You don't have to buy any of it, but you can't just take it.
And what is supplied with a special price for what would be imported over the sort of 10%.
Yes, and
Price, and it's actually having a virtual storage.
so this is the other point. There is a special deal. If Russia's going to keep transiting Georgia, they'd like you to keep buying gas. So if you buy more than they were expecting, they're actually going to give you a discount. Azerbaijan says that this is dangerous foolishness. Does anybody agree? Is it?
That's depends on the point of view.
Okay.
From Azerbaijan's point of view, it may be the case that you
Yes.
presented right now.
Yeah.
From the Russian point of view, it's a different story.
From the Georgian point of view, what do you think?
It depends again whom
Yeah.
Georgia would like to make a real business with Azerbaijanis go on or with Russia. So you have, I would say, a case of 50 to 50.
And Georgia has, it's very attractive to have more than one supplier. You know, the minute you've only got one supplier, you can't promise, even if they're more friendly to your nation than Russia has been, you can't promise that you're not going to have problems if you only have one supplier.
You must look for a third supplier.
That's right.
Your approach is basically only on commercial interest, what is specific to the, let's say, free market.
And this,
Market approach. But the problem is, and this is something we know in the European Union, this kind of objectives, like, college, having some kind of piece of infrastructure, especially they are important
rather than me
you are approaching the issue purely in terms of economic competition and political competition over resources. But this kind of infrastructure, like a storage like a storage installation or other type of infrastructure, they are having a, like we see in Europe, a very important attraction to what is creating, integrating processes.
Yes.
So nations which used to have, difference are so interested into this project that are ready, to set aside some of them and, work together. And this is actually something which has to be presented or at least told, people to have in mind also this aspect. That's one point. Talking about, Azerbaijan, now the biggest problem is not how Azerbaijan is going to react to that. The problem is how or how much gas it's able Azerbaijan
Yes.
to deliver in order to keep that big pipeline, which I'm not sure it's
Not as fully represented yet.
20, I think 28 B are for now. For the
That's
current
correct. And
stage.
the,
It will be
the
much,
next date is 60
it
to
would be
120.
much,
Yeah.
much later.
Mhm.
And that's the whole issue.
That's right.
And if I would be here in Tbilisi, some responsible on that, I will try to find a way, to, in cases, I would be not able to get that gas.
In fact, as Azerbaijan gears up to sell more and more gas, there have been interruptions in your supply from Azerbaijan because Azerbaijan is very worried about getting the infrastructure in place on time, and not everything is going exactly as planned. So there are some real challenges. One of the things that's happening, it's in discussion, it's an interesting thing to watch, but again, there is this question. Iran being involved with Armenia changes your negotiating position with Russia, but Iran being involved with Azerbaijan, which it also is, creates some options for Georgia. Georgia is actually exploring the possibility of buying Iranian gas. It is also exploring the possibility of buying Turkmen gas, because again, remember, Iran thinks it wants to be a transit state. We don't know how they'll behave as a transit state, and it will add some interesting new complexities. But there is this idea that if you can get supply not only from Azerbaijan or Russia, but there are other options, that's interesting. Now, you already raised some of this. Georgia joining the energy community means that some of your rules are going to change. You're getting closer and closer to free market systems. The design of your electricity and your gas trade is getting more and more like Turkey, and less like Azerbaijan and Armenia and Russia. There is an effort on the part of Georgia to convince Armenia and Azerbaijan of the merits of going toward a more free market. But in fact, Georgia has made a choice, and the parliament is probably going to ratify it this month, to move more and more toward a European economic model, even though most of your neighbors are not in that model. So to emphasize the economics in political economy, even though in your region energy has been kind of with a, if you use the word political economy, which one are you emphasizing? Well, Georgia's trying to go toward economy. The region has mostly been a lot of emphasis on political, so it creates some interesting challenges. Does it make sense for Georgia to try aggressively to sell electricity internationally?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
There's a potential, and it's not exhaustible like fossil energy, but
I think
renewable.
you can also, I'm sorry, you can also offer swaps.
Yes.
electricity.
Good. And Georgia has that option. One of the beautiful things about the way Georgian law treats energy, and I think this is important both environmentally, but it's also very clever. In your law, renewable energy is prioritized in the grid over any kind of energy that you get from burning fossil fuels, which means that under Georgian law, if Azerbaijan is trying to sell gas-fired electricity across your territory, when your streams are running full power, your streams have legal priority, and Azerbaijan will not be able to enter your grid, even though you're on a pure economic basis. So it's environmentally sensible. It's also rather politically clever that you have built into your law always giving priority to renewable energy. What are some of the disadvantages of moving to this, to the Europeanized system for thinking about energy?
First of all, regulations that have to go to the reform of the administration of the continue what is done.
Yes. It really, energy in Georgia feels like a perpetual revolution. You have so many things that you're trying to change, and you're always continuously moving on to the next stage of change, and that is a real challenge.
Where is the level of investment? New technology,
And the investors, Georgia wants to build all this stuff with foreign direct investment. The foreign investors look at it and say, really? You're going to change the rules again? And so you get,
That's something that has to be learned.
yes.
How to use the so-called green certificates actually as a resource that is
Yes.
as much important as money.
There's an awful lot of nuances that Georgia itself doesn't yet understand that Georgia's going to have to implement. So you can expect a perpetual revolution in energy. And although it gets you eventually to a better place, it is a downside to be in a place that's in perpetual energy revolution. But it is also, okay. So we've kind of hit,
I have a question.
yes,
By the way.
sure.
How the other side, for example, how the other countries, like in the region, like Azerbaijan, reacts to this kind of a revolution that's underway?
It's a great question. I am actually going to get a better answer to this next week because I'm going to go spend a month in Azerbaijan. But Azerbaijan is a little bit bewildered because they believe, so let's completely leave the Georgian perspective for a minute and think about the Azeri perspective. Azerbaijan believes that they are too reliant on oil and gas don't employ very many people. Electricity, on the other hand, is a very interesting mixed commodity because in one way, it's a commodity, but it's also a service. It employs a lot of people and it adds value. So it has now become, shall we say, fashionable for gas states to get involved in electricity. And Azerbaijan wants to produce this electricity and they want to sell it. And they want Georgia to be their transit state.
What about Iran?
But Georgia keeps, Georgia keeps changing the rules, so Azerbaijan is a little bit unhappy with this. I do think that you're going to find, as time goes on, that Iran would be very happy to have electricity exported from Georgia. That's going to require developing the relationship with Armenia. In truth, Georgia and Armenia are natural partners because Georgia has only, well, mostly hydro, and Armenia has mostly nuclear, and nuclear does not make a stable grid. Nuclear plus hydro makes a very stable grid. So if you can work it out on a system that is acceptable to both countries, it's actually better for the region, and that's why the investment was made in the interconnector. But until Iran gets involved, the volumes are not going to be big enough. So you've built a big piece of infrastructure on the border with Armenia, and it's not going to get used very much until you can find a way to reach Iran and begin doing that. Iran has said they're very interested in electricity trade, and in fact they already do a lot of electricity trade with Armenia. So Iran is probably going to lead that fight. Instead of having to negotiate hard with Armenia, Iran's going to negotiate hard with Armenia because they want your electricity. There was the big dream of reaching the Turkish market. Everybody wanted to reach the Turkish market. The Turkish market collapsed. And the Turkish market collapsed for two reasons. One is that with all the uncertainty in Turkey right now, the economic growth they were experiencing has gone away, so they're not growing at the predicted rate. And the other reason is everyone was so excited about trying to reach the Turkish market that there is now too much capacity given the rate at which Turkey is, so that it's overbuilt. So until Turkey grows a little bit and things settle back down, reaching the Turkish market is possible. It's not as attractive as we thought it would be. Any other questions?
Well, actually, I'd like to ask you, first of all, thank you for a very interesting presentation. To analyze a little bit or to deliver your opinion regarding the advantages and disadvantages of the agreement from your point of view with Gazprom, with the new agreement. Or go more into detail this issue. Okay, thank you.
I will try, but as you know, the criticism of this agreement is that it has not been fully transparent. So I can comment on what I know of the agreement, but I can't comment on what has not been explained. First, I want to talk a little bit about non-transparency. Anytime you're trying to make a deal with Gazprom, they prefer that it be non-transparent. And the reason they prefer that it be non-transparent, yeah, some of it you can say, oh, well, it's, you know, Russians being sneaky. Every single transit state has a different deal. And Gazprom doesn't like to make it easy for all the transit states to compare and say, oh, well, I want the deal that they've got. So Gazprom prefers a deal that is non-transparent and a deal that mixes some non-economic things in with the economic things. So, for example, in the Georgian deal, you are released from, and stop me if I get too much jargon, in gas, because you want to keep the pipeline full. It's very important to keep it full. Usually the deals that you sign are called take or pay. So if 1 year you don't want as much gas as you contracted for, you still have to pay for it, even if you don't take it. So typically, gas deals are take or pay. You don't have it. In the current deal that was negotiated, Georgia is not committed to take anything from the pipeline. So you have the option to take nothing, and that's really good. So that's a win. The second thing is the price that Russia has offered for gas above 10%. Basically, they've said, the first 10% in our pipeline, since we used to give that to you, we'll sell it to you at one price. If you go above 10%, we'll give you a better deal. In fact, both the amount that you're being asked to pay for the first 10% and the amount that you're being asked to pay over 10% is less than what Azerbaijan asked you to pay. So there is a price competition here that is advantageous to Georgia. And the flexibility is actually the big win, because now if you don't want to buy a lot of gas from Russia, if you only buy gas when Azerbaijan can't supply, you've still enhanced your own security without getting to. So I think that's the key. The fact that you don't have you're not obliged to take a certain amount is a problem. Gazprom is hoping that that cheap price will be so attractive that you'll buy more and more from them, because they don't like the fact that Azerbaijan has 80% of your market. Azerbaijan says, we've seen this movie before. Don't buy gas from the Russians. You can't trust them. So Russia's offering a price signal that may be tempting and could be, by some definitions, dangerous. The other good thing in the deal is that because you are joining the Energy Acquis, the transit fee, how much you charge Russia, can be established in Georgian law and changed in Georgian law. So you don't have to renegotiate the transit fee every time. Regulatory has to assess it and say, this is the fair price and this is what you must pay. And that is actually quite a nod to your regulatory, and I think is strengthening. Now the downside of this deal is it isn't as good a deal as what you had before. And that very flexibility of come on over closer to here could be dangerous for Georgia. I'm actually very optimistic about trying to involve either Iran or Turkmenistan in being a third supplier, because I don't think that the Georgian gas market moves to a safer, more commercial space until you have one more player that you can buy from. And I don't know how long that will take or how hard it will be to negotiate, but I know that Iran wants to transit. I know that Turkmenistan wants to sell. And I know that Azerbaijan is considering their options.
We're not considering yet another flexible development. It's natural gas, which is also possibly to be transported and located in different locations in a very, very flexible way. And this is actually what is the new deal that seems to appear in the region. Thank you.
There are two possibilities in Georgia for your own natural gas, and one of them is there is this resource of gas that there have been some claims that you have an enormous amount of gas. You might, but it is still not economically possible to get it out of the ground. It's important to make a distinction between resources, which means stuff that's under the ground, and if money were no object, you get it, and stuff that are reserves, which means things that are under the ground that you can actually get out and not lose more money than you make. It is clear that Georgia has resources of gas, but whether those are reserves or not remain unclear and may be technology dependent. The other place where Georgia may have its own natural gas is you're beginning to get some investigation into coal bed methane. You have coal, wherever you have coal, particularly the kind of coal that you have, there's natural gas associated with it, and they're a fairly straightforward technology for getting the gas out. The Georgian Industrial Group is now investing in trying to get the methane out of the coal that they have the rights to mine. If that turns out to be profitable, that's another domestic resource. You had a question behind. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm very much impressed. Thank you. My question is about, could you please tell us a little bit more about Azerbaijani gas production, and which is falling?
Yes.
And my second question is, you mentioned Turkmenistan. Do you have any recent information of the dispute, price dispute between Turkmenistan and Iran, which hinders this swap deal?
Yeah.
My question actually is
Oh, good. Okay, go ahead.
it's almost identical what I had in mind, but can I just add whether you foresee any chance of Turkmen gas, which is not a resource but a reserve, very clearly, and a huge one of that, ever reaching the European market via Georgia or maybe through other means, for instance through Iran? But the question before me may be kind of the key in that.
Okay, Iran and Turkmenistan have a very long-standing problem, and the problem is that particularly after all the years of sanctions, Iran prefers very much to pay for gas in non-monetary commodities. They really like to essentially trade trinkets for gas. And in an earlier period when the Turkmenbashi was building gold statues all the time, the Iranians would always offer up some gold or something that shiny objects instead of money. Now that Turkmenistan is selling most of its gas to China, and unfortunately for Turkmenistan, selling gas to China doesn't make them any money right now because China came in with an offer that sounded very attractive. Pay no money now. We're going to build this pipeline for you, and you can pay us in gas over time. And Turkmenistan took that deal. So even though they're exporting 60 billion cubic meters a year to China, most of it is to pay for the pipeline that China built for them. So Turkmenistan finds itself in a place where what they want most in the world is cash. And they turn to Russia and say, hey, you used to want a lot of our gas, don't you want some? And Russia basically says, no, you chose a new partner, we will take no gas from you. Forget it. Iran says, we love your gas, we love your gas, but we'd like to pay you in a combination of money and trinkets. So essentially what's happened is for a time, Turkmenistan carried the debt for Iran and was willing to do so. Turkmenistan's economy is kind of in free fall right now. There's no money coming in, and so they're trying to collect these old debts from Iran. And that's hard, because of course Iran's out from under sanctions and they're really not able to pay. I think that where this is going, and I don't know this, I'm actually going to be in Turkmenistan in 2 months, and hopefully I'll find out. But essentially, I think what they're going to do is they're going to try to leverage this to get Iran to be their transit state. In other words, basically say, give us access to this set of pipelines that you're not using anyway. We will pay you in gas for transit, but you've got to get our gas across. And in fact, Turkmenistan is quite eager to do this. Azerbaijan is a little less eager. And now your question about Azerbaijan and how much gas they have. Azerbaijan is used to the idea that they're running out of oil, that they're past peak, but they have this infinite reserve of gas that is just coming online. Unfortunately, it's coming online more slowly than they'd hoped, and they have overpromised. So Azerbaijan has an interesting problem. imagine, again, what's your strategic approach, and there's more than one that would make sense. Azerbaijan looks at this and says, okay, we really want to keep that European market. We think that 3 years from now we'll fix this problem and the gas will be flowing spectacularly. Do we let somebody else into our pipeline now and try to get them back out later? Do we keep the competition out of the pipeline because we think we're going to need it ourselves? What do we do? And the Azeri government is very divided about this. They're very skeptical about letting Turkmenistan have a permanent place in their pipeline, and they're not sure about letting them have a temporary space. I don't know how much diplomacy Georgia is engaged in right now to try to deal with this problem, but it is very much in Georgia's interests to resolve this in Turkmenistan's favor. So I'm watching this to see how it unfolds. Turkmenistan is in a difficult position. Remember, Turkmenistan is very sort of impressively authoritarian. And the leadership in the Ministry of Gas and Oil has promised the president that they can get money back into the system. But they don't know how. They're trying to build the Trans-Afghan pipeline. Let's see now, this is a pipeline that originates in Turkmenistan, goes across Afghanistan, continues into Pakistan, and finishes in India. What could possibly go wrong? And since the Turkmen government itself is responsible for 85% of the cost and for organizing the pipeline, what could possibly go wrong? Turkmenistan is pretty desperate right now for a win. And the win they want is this transit with Iran, but we'll see if they're successful in getting it. And they are going to have to either give Iran some debt forgiveness or fold the debt into the pipeline deal, I think, in order to be able to move forward on it.
You incited me with the story of Turkmenistan, and I want to give my dime to your story, because I was also ambassador for 5 years in Turkmenistan, so I quite know very well Turkmenistan. So it's not the first time, the Iranians and the Turkmens do have this different. It was first was in 1998 even, and indeed it was an issue of money. Turkmenistan needs cash. It's true, but Turkmenistan, and this, I can stand up eventually.
Sure, come on.
No, but Turkmenistan has a very special policy. They sell the gas at the border.
Yes, they do.
This is unique. And it's actually the job and the buyer how it takes, the gas from Turkmenian border, I don't know, over the Caspian, in Iran, and so on. So that's one of the points. You were speaking about China.
Yeah.
Well, it's not exactly that how you presented the deal. The deal is much more complicated.
Yes.
In what sense? Because Chinese actually provided loans for Turkmenistan of about 10 billion. And of this money, the Turkmens cashed in only something about 3 of these billions, which was actually the price to allow the Chinese and oil company to exploit and to extract the gas in this very special territory. It's called contractual territory of the Amur Darya, which is squeezed between the Amur Darya river and the Uzbek border. The rest are credit lines for the Chinese companies, working in Turkmenistan, and those are the only foreign companies which were allowed to operate on land.
Yeah.
All the others are invited to come to work in the Caspian Sea.
No, that's
And TAPI, when it comes to TAPI, this is an old story. We started, probably better than me, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, this is a very tricky project.
Yeah.
Because first of all, it crosses an area which is very unstable, and they don't want, the Turkmens, for instance, would not want to bring into the fields, especially in this field in Yolotan, Western companies, which might come with investments, and they will require probably from their PSA party sharing agreement quantity of gas in order to cover the investment and eventually sell it to China.
Yeah, well, this is the important thing to understand about Turkmenistan. If you look at proven reserves, so this is not what might be in the ground, but what we know is there and we can get cheaply, Turkmenistan has the 4th largest reserves in the world. And there are only 5 million people who live there. So Turkmenistan has hundreds of years worth of natural gas. But, as you pointed out, they do not want to allow any foreign companies to, nobody builds a pipeline unless you have some rights to oversee exploitation of the oil and gas. So in other words, BP would not just build a pipeline in Azerbaijan. If they weren't a part owner in the drilling, you want to make sure that you own some of the ground that has the riches in it, or you won't build a pipeline. That's typical. Turkmenistan has not allowed any companies to do that except China, unless they go offshore. Right, unless they go offshore. So Turkmenistan is slowing development dramatically because they don't want to let anyone else own that land. China's been very willing to be upfront with large amounts of money, and the government spent it quickly and not all on the pipelines. And so it's a very complex problem that has to do with governance. But Turkmenistan is now in this moment where they're trying to figure out, Turkmenistan, I would say, is terrified of political risk most of the time. And then when they're broke and desperate, they suddenly do something brave and dramatic. and then they go back to being afraid. They didn't have a pipeline to Iran until a major gas crisis with Russia in 1997, and then they built it. They didn't have a pipeline to China until a great gas crisis during the global economic downturn with Russia, and then they built it. They're in another economic downturn, in an economic crisis, so I'm waiting to see what risk they are suddenly willing to take. Because
You can say something about what is the capacity of the pipelines from Turkmenistan to Iran, and what's the reason actually Iran does import Turkmen gas. Because this is also a story that people have to understand, especially the people, our friends who asked for. And coming, not to forget, the issue of the Turkmen gas going through Azerbaijan. Well, it would be a moment when they are going to decide sooner or later on this matter. The same happened also with the Baku-Ceyhan pipeline. The moment the production of oil from BP especially went down, there was some capacity in the pipe. So the first to be invited were the Kazakhs, which were very happy, and now even the Turkmens are, well, not exactly Turkmens, it's actually a company which is operating in the offshore of Turkmenistan, so Dragon Oil.
Oh, yeah.
It's actually supplying the pipe. So that's...
One of the really fun things about watching pipelines is once pipelines are laid, it's almost as though states have the ability to build national interests. Because once a pipeline exists, keeping it full is a very important strategic interest. And a lot of negotiations in the region have shifted and changed when there was suddenly space in the pipeline. So when Azerbaijan discovered that the oil was going down and they became desperate to get more oil in the pipeline, they made new deals with Kazakhstan. The hope is it is unlikely that Turkmenistan will build a pipeline across the Caspian like this, but there's a set of reserves in the middle of the sea that are debated, whether does Azerbaijan own them or does Turkmenistan, and it's a very hot debate, and they're very angry about it. But if they're both desperate enough and they agree to exploit it jointly, then that will ensure that the gas pipeline from Azerbaijan stays full. And when we talk about does Azerbaijan want competition in the pipeline, what Azerbaijan wants most in the pipeline is to do it with Turkmenistan if necessary, but to get that mid-sea gas in the pipeline and forward.
For
They haven't,
Caspian Summit in Baku 2010.
I don't,
On that occasion, they stated the joint declaration of both Aliyev and Mohamed that is not an issue of the other
yes.
coastal countries to decide and to accept this infrastructure. That's a matter
So let's think about,
between Baku and Ashgabat because it's going through the state.
it's a brave statement, but if both Iran and Russia are opposed to laying permanent infrastructure on the floor of the sea, and Iran and Russia are the only two that have capable navies, you can really say we're going to do it and we don't care what you think, but I've never seen Turkmenistan follow through on we're going to do it and we don't care what you think in a way where Russia could really push back at them. And if it's possible, Turkmenistan would actually, if they can get it to work, Turkmenistan would rather use Iran as a transit state than chance going across the water because then they know that Iran would support it and Russia would not have room to object. So it's possible but unlikely. The other thing that's possible and maybe more likely is that they built a pipeline that moves the gas further up north because the idea was they were going to put it into the Kazakh system. It is quite possible that Turkmenistan would be willing to run a pipeline much further north because if they're far enough north of Iran that Iran doesn't have strategic concerns, then all they have to worry about is Russia. They're not going to do something that pisses off both of them, but they might be willing to take on one. Yeah. Yeah.
It's actually the old first gas
Yeah.
pipeline from Turkmenia to Russia. This is a small one. It was 3B when it was installed. Now it's probably so degraded that 1B per year. And there was a discussion actually to modernize it and raise the capacity. And the gas, which is from here, is from China. This
Mhm.
area. It's actually where also Geor was around. Turkmenistan doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, it's Turkmenabad. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Turkmenabad, Soitabad, how it's called now. It's actually connected by two pipes to
Mhm.
Iran, together with the pipe that
Right.
was made first. We have a capacity of delivering of 20 billion.
Mm-hmm.
Because of this problem with the cash, they are not working at full capacity.
Right.
And the reason why the Iranians are buying gas is that in this area, which is called Khorasan in Iran, and also in this area, south of the Caspian Sea, there is no resources of gas, and the infrastructures coming
Right.
from central Iran was not built yet, also because of sanctions.
Yes. All right.
So could you go back to the question you mentioned earlier about whether it is reasonable for the government of Georgia to set this goal of keeping and benefiting both north-south and
Mhm.
east-west transit, and tell us what you think about that.
I think that the argument that I've heard is persuasive, which is that you have to maintain this for at least 2 years. It will take 2 years for Russia to finalize. If they're going to change the infrastructure for Armenia, it will take at least 2 years to do that. If Georgia's going to establish gas reserves, it'll take at least 2 years to do it. So you would take a deal, even if it's a bad deal, for at least 2 years because you need those 2 years to contemplate your other infrastructure options. Ideally, I think that you would want to continue to be a transit state. I think that you want to continue to do north-south and east-west. I'm not sure because I'm not over, my interest is more in strategy than it is in economics. I'm not sure that you want to make it easy to buy an increasing amount of gas from Russia, but I do think that you want to maintain the transit and a minimum amount of purchase for at least 2 years because Russia has demonstrated that you can cut them off or use your power once. And after you've done that, they will come up with other options.
There will be no longer kisses of Geor. That's it.
Exactly. And I mean, look at Turkmenistan. You know, they did something that Russia disliked, and Russia went from importing 60 billion cubic meters a year to accepting no gas from them as a punishment.
First of all, thank you very much. You mentioned strategy, and my question goes to that. What would you suggest as the pillars of Georgia's energy security, maybe for next 10 years?
Okay, that's fun. I might get this wrong because I haven't got this. This is a question I'm still working on, but here are a few things that I would put in my strategy. I know that it is controversial, but I think that the government's argument that they need to build at least some large hydropower above Nguri is correct. I think that they need it to manage the sediment, and I also think that although I would not want you to abandon Nguri, that to let the largest single object in your infrastructure be on contested territory is unacceptably dangerous. So I do think that the large-scale hydro is necessary. Now, the way they're negotiating it, there may be some real problems with that, and they may need to come up with other ways to approach it, but I do find the argument to build large hydropower on the Nguri River persuasive. That's one. Second, the gas reserves are attractive, but how they're going to be managed and making sure that that Georgia doesn't develop the Uranian problem of disappearing reserves is extremely important, because unless you manage that reserve very clearly and carefully and can regulate it on a daily basis, there's lots of mischief that can be made with strategic reserves inside of countries, and you don't want to make room for more corruption to grow in the gas sector. So a properly regulated reserve is very important. If Azerbaijan has a minority share in it, I don't think that's dangerous for Georgia, but I think you need to decide, the government needs to decide how many cubic meters you need to get you through a predictable emergency, and make sure that whatever deal you cut with Azerbaijan, that Georgia can keep its own lights on for a week-long crisis would be your goal. The third thing is, I do think that Georgia, I don't know how this will work because Turkmenistan is confusing and so is Iran. To the extent that Georgia can be involved in these negotiations to try to get a third player in its gas system, I think that would be a great goal. In the new energy law, which is currently being reviewed and debated, the thing that nobody knows how to do well is something that you must do well, and that is we have thought about electricity for a very long time in terms of there are producers, there are transit companies, and there are consumers. Georgia has the possibility to do a lot of wind and solar, small scale. Unless you build your energy law and build your grid to make room for that, it will be a great loss to Georgia. In the United States, just to give you an example of we did it wrong, the two states in America that have the best prospects for solar power, Nevada and Hawaii, are currently allowing no new solar to be built. And it's because they couldn't figure out what to do about the fact that there are these large, whether it's casinos or Walmarts or whatever, that are generating power on their own roof, and part of the day they're selling it to the grid, and part of the day they're buying it from the grid, and this is economically destroying transmission. So in other words, we have the technology to move to renewables, but in most countries we have set energy laws in place that make it against commercial interests to allow renewables. Now, I think since Georgia is currently writing its law, it's extremely important to make room for that, because Georgia, as a country that has to import so much of its fossil use, to the extent that you cannot need fossil, it's a strategically important thing, and you need to make sure that your laws are very friendly for wind and solar. I think the other issue, and the World Bank overstated this, Georgia does need to use your hydro resources, but there is no country that is entirely reliant on hydro that does not have major instabilities because of the seasonal nature of hydro. So doing the gas power plants does make sense. The numbers might not, but you've got to have a little bit of more traditional power to stabilize And I do think it makes sense for Georgia to try to trade. I think Iran is who you most want to sell power to. And I think you want to do it, I think you want to work things out with Armenia so that you can do that. Those are the pieces of what I would put. Okay?
Energy security. It's the fact that the current gas distribution system of pipes in Georgia is very old. Has to be rebuilt, has to be repaired, because the losses are
Yep.
unacceptable by the end of the day. That's one point. And actually, to come to support your statement of energy, they have to look also in the future. So Georgia, clearly it is going to be a transport corridor from Europe to China to Iran and so on. The fact that, and this is an advantage for Georgia, all railway
Okay.
lines in Georgia are electrified. And this is since the old times. But you really need constant energy. If indeed the capacity of the Georgian railways, which is something like several millions, more than 20 millions per year, is going to be used, then you are having, you know, all these moments when the need of electricity will rise. So even if you have the gas, you have the thermal power plants working and, you know, constantly delivering electricity, or even, you know, importing electricity from other sites, you need something to cover this peak, and this cover cannot be covered in any other way than, you know, hydropower plant.
This is an area that I'm not familiar with, how rail fits into the equation. That's a good insight. I'll look into it. One thing that I would like to add, and I have to credit Rahman for this because we had a very interesting conversation about it earlier today. In Georgian energy law, and there is no part of Georgian energy law that takes into account biomass, in other words, your trees. And because gas is expensive here, even if you renovate the gas delivery system, which you should do because of the losses, it's still going to be in the individual economic interest of households to burn wood instead. The problem is the long-term implications for Georgia are quite serious. So how to begin thinking about where wood fits in your system and where it should fit in your system is another big piece of longer-term energy security for Georgia that I think is underexplored. It's hard to have a complete strategy if you don't include the fact that if prices rise too much, people will just cut down all the trees. And since that's an externality we don't want, how do you take that into the way you think about it? You had a question?
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Just one question. You highlighted the, let's say, the difficulty in trading with Russia from a gas point of view, and that it's quite politically controversial, etc.
Yes.
I'm competing.
I can see that.
So it's quite politically difficult, and it's controversial to trade with gas. They don't seem to have the same difficulty with electricity. Why is there a distinction like this?
I'm so glad you asked that because I've always been fascinated by that. The answer is that InterRAO, the electricity company, is a company that in countries where the regulatory is strong, they actually function very well. And in countries where the regulatory is weak, they're quite predatory. So InterRAO is a very nimble corporation, and they are persuaded, I think in a way it has worked to Georgia's advantage that Russia is a significant owner in Telasi, because InterRAO has experienced the fact that a better regulated market and that the way that Georgia is running it works. And actually, I have some real concerns about some adventures that InterRAO might have in Abkhazia. But the way InterRAO works with Georgia is actually exemplary, and an awful lot of other countries that work with InterRAO are quite envious.
So let's take these two questions, Teresa, and then I think we need to
maybe it sounds a little bit old-fashioned, but what do you think about coal industry? So So Americans are reviving, as far as I know, and we have some resources in Georgia. Do you think it could be useful?
I think that it makes more sense for Georgia than it does for the United States. The issue in the United States is that we have such an abundance of natural gas that although our president has promised to bring coal back, the economics are against it even if you relax the environmental laws. Because natural gas, just to sort of think about it this way, if you want to build a new power plant and you build coal and you guess wrong what demand is going to look like, you will lose a lot of money. If you build a gas power plant, you can still operate at a profit even if you're only selling a third of what you built the plant to run, okay? So if you're not sure what your market looks like, build a gas plant, not a coal one. So in America, where we don't have any base load needs, we have a little bit of needs around the margins but no big loads, not only is gas cheaper, it's a safer investment, and it's almost impossible to figure out how you would force more coal back into the American electricity grid. Now, the Georgian experience is a little bit different. I'm most interested, from my perspective, the coal bed methane that you have and whether or not you can capture that is actually very important. The GIG agreement to build the coal-fired power plant makes some sense in terms of energy security, although here's the downside, and this is what I don't like about it. In Georgian law, you have a preference for hydro, as you should. The new coal power plant gets an exemption from that. Because in order to keep the mine going, which they're doing more as a jobs program than as an energy program, you've got to make sure that the power plant is going all the time. So even when you are selling surplus hydro to Turkey or to Russia at a discount, you are still going to be burning coal down in Garbani. I understand why the investors prefer that, but I don't think it's a great deal for Georgia. I do think that there is an argument that you don't, if all your power plants that are not hydro are gas, then you are vulnerable to loss of gas. So it is rational to have at least one plant that uses your indigenous reserves that is not hydro. I'm just not sure the deal is structured properly.
Thank you very much. Since you mentioned your president just a few minutes ago, understandably why there is a big discussion and debate in Georgia whether the new administration will have well, the proper vision for this part of the world. And as we look at this map, and as we are talking and discussing the transit potential or capacity or prospects of Georgia, and export capacity of Azerbaijan, and also Turkey, a great beneficiary on the ground. So these policies of making energy transit and making this region of important energy transit region was very strongly supported in late 90s by your government. And if not even personal involvement of high-ranking officials in White House, even the president, then this project would not come into being. Because, obviously, Russia was against East-West energy transit. So my question would be, how this administration views this region, and to what extent it cares about development in this part of the world in terms of energy, trade, whether or not the established status quo of energy trade is contributing to the peace and stability, and if at all, Washington these days cares about these questions.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
I want to step back to a moment to what you said about pipelines in this region. When I was showing you the maps and saying that, you know, there's economic logic and there's political logic, and purely political pipelines almost very seldom get built, the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline was more a political than an economic pipeline when it was built. It turned out to be a very good idea and very profitable, but there were huge questions at the outset, and Washington was extremely involved in that pipeline. Not only in the current administration, but even in the previous one, there has been a resistance to getting involved in more of those pipelines. TAPI was a project that Turkmenistan and Pakistan and India and all the generals in Afghanistan really wanted to see it built and thought that it could only be built if there was strong U.S. leadership. The U.S. government failed to take that mantle and go with it. And I think the reason is that the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline was attractive because the government at that time, and it was supported across two administrations that disagreed about most things, but there was a recognition that the continued sovereignty of this part of the world depended on being able to establish some way to reach the West. I don't think that enhancing the sovereignty of this part of the world has been as high a priority in the Obama administration, and I don't think that it will be in a Trump administration. In a Trump administration, and it is very early and we don't know this, but it is likely that the United States will identify a group of countries that it sees as strategic partners, continue to commit resources to those countries, and step back from a lot others. I think there's a very good chance that Georgia will remain on the strategic partner list, but I don't know what that will mean in terms of resources. I do think that the current administration is going to be much better at bilateral than at anything multilateral, and there are no pipelines, as far as the eye can see, that would not be multilateral, so I think it's not going to be a strength of theirs. But I also think, on the one other positive note, is that I have some reservations about the Secretary of State, but in fact he understands energy extremely well and is personally interested in these issues, and that gives us some hope. But it is early to say, and right now, from watching the news from far away, it looks like we're going to have a large unfolding domestic political crisis that is going to capture the energy of not only the White House but the Congress for probably the next year. So I don't think the United States is going to make a strategic retreat from the world. I think the United States has just tripped over its own feet and is going to be focused on trying to clean up a significant mess at home.
Thank you, Teresa, very much for the comprehensive presentation and discussion. And please join me in thanking